Imagine winning your freedom, only to face your old master again. Just 3 decades after the American Revolution, Britain returned to remind the young United States that independence was never guaranteed. Their mighty warships prowled the seas, seizing American sailors. Their redcoats marched with the confidence of empire. And soon, the flames of war reached the very heart of America, setting its capital ablaze. But from those flames rose defiance. This is the story of fire and survival, of a White House left in ashes, of a flag that refused to fall, and of a nation that had to prove, once more, that it would never bow to an empire. The year was 1812. The United States was still young, barely 36 years removed from the signing of the Declaration of Independence. But even in freedom, the shadow of Britain still loomed large. Across the Atlantic, Europe was consumed by the Napoleonic Wars, and America found itself caught in the middle. Britain, determined to choke Napoleon's France, imposed harsh blockades on trade, and American ships were often stopped, searched, and sometimes seized outright. Even worse, British warships captured American sailors and forced them into the Royal Navy, a practice known as impressment. For ordinary Americans, it was an insult that cut deep. Hadn't the Revolution been fought to escape this very kind of domination? On the docks of Boston, New York, and Baltimore, merchants watched helplessly as their livelihoods crumbled under British restrictions. Farmers in the West, eager to sell their grain, cursed the Crown for strangling their markets. And out on the open sea, sailors whispered bitterly about being dragged from their homes to fight in Britain's endless European wars. Tension built like storm clouds over the young republic, and whispers of war spread from taverns to the halls of Congress. Yet this was not just about sailors or trade. For many Americans, it was about honor. Britain treated the United States, not as a sovereign equal, but as a troublesome child. The humiliation stung, and leaders in Washington grew restless. Thomas Jefferson had once boasted that conquering Canada would be a mere matter of marching. But now the question was not just conquest, it was survival. Could the fledgling nation stand against the greatest empire in the world again? The stage was set for a conflict that would test America's endurance, pride, and very identity. When Congress finally declared war on June 18, 1812, the United States stepped into a storm it was barely prepared to face. And so began what many called America's Second War of Independence. The declaration of war sent shockwaves through the country. To the so-called war hawks in Congress, young leaders like Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, it was a moment of triumph. They had argued passionately for war, seeing it not only as a way to defend America's honor, but also as an opportunity to expand the nation's territory, especially into British Canada. They promised victories would be swift, perhaps even glorious. The people, stirred by fiery speeches, rallied behind the flag. Volunteers filled militia ranks, and newspapers printed patriotic calls to arms. For many, the war was more than politics. It was personal. Families who had lost loved ones to British impressment, merchants ruined by blockades, and settlers worried about British-backed native raids all longed for justice. The idea of finally humbling Britain once and for all carried a certain intoxicating appeal. At sea, early victories gave hope. American frigates like the USS Constitution earned fame by defeating mighty British ships in single combat. Sailors cheered as cannon fire thundered across the waves, and when the Constitution blasted the HMS Guerrière into submission, Americans nicknamed her Old Ironsides. These triumphs proved that the U.S. Navy, though small, was fierce and capable. On land, however, things were far less glorious. The war hawks had promised Canada would fall easily, but the reality was humiliating. Poorly trained militias faltered, supply lines broke down, and American attempts to invade across the border ended in retreat. In places like Detroit, American Generals surrendered without firing a shot. Still, in the hearts of the people, the belief lingered that the United States could endure. Every victory at sea, every speech in Congress, and every defiant act against Britain fed the rising spirit that America would not bow. The rise of war was messy, unsteady, and often chaotic. Yet beneath it all was the heartbeat of a young nation, determined to prove itself, ready to take on its old master no matter the odds. The British struck back with a vengeance. Their navy, unmatched in power, tightened its stranglehold on American ports. Trade collapsed, leaving coastal cities desperate. Farmers in the interior watched their crops rot without buyers, while New England merchants cursed the war, some even whispering of secession. The war that had begun as a cry for honor was now grinding America down. Then came the summer of 1814, when Britain unleashed its full fury. Redcoats marched into Washington, D.C., facing little resistance. In a shocking act meant to break American morale, they torched the Capitol, the Library of Congress, and the White House itself. Flames licked the night sky as smoke rose over the young republic's capital. Citizens fled in panic, and for many it seemed the revolution's fragile victory was about to be erased. But amidst despair, moments of resilience glimmered. At Baltimore's Fort McHenry, American defenders stood against relentless bombardment from British ships. Rockets hissed through the night, bombs burst in the sky, yet the flag still waved at dawn. Francis Scott Key, watching from a ship, scribbled lines that would become the Star-Spangled Banner, a song that captured the unbroken spirit of the nation. On the frontier, the conflict grew even more complicated. Native American tribes, led by figures like Tecumseh, allied with the British, hoping to stop American expansion into their lands. Fierce battles erupted in the Northwest, where native warriors fought with courage and determination. For settlers and soldiers alike, the war was not just against Britain, but against neighbors and tribes who had long resisted the American tide. The conflict stretched across sea and land, brutal and uncertain. Each victory was shadowed by defeat, and each act of courage weighed against bitter loss. America, under siege, learned that survival itself could be a form of victory. For Native Americans, the war was more than a contest of empires. It was a last, desperate stand. Tecumseh, the Shawnee leader, dreamed of uniting tribes into a confederacy strong enough to resist American expansion. He fought fiercely alongside the British, believing they would honor their promises to protect native lands. But when Tecumseh fell in battle in 1813, the dream died with him. By war's end, Britain abandoned its native allies in the peace negotiations, leaving them to face the unstoppable push of American settlers alone. To them, it was not just betrayal, it was a death sentence for their way of life. Ordinary Americans, too, felt betrayed. The war hawks had promised conquest of Canada, but the Treaty of Ghent, signed in December 1814, restored borders to exactly what they had been before the war. No territory was gained. No lasting concessions were won. Families who had lost sons on the battlefield asked bitterly what their sacrifices had been for. Merchants who had endured years of ruin questioned the value of a war that left the economy shattered. Even soldiers who had fought bravely wondered why victory felt so hollow. To many, it seemed the war had ended in stalemate, a costly gamble that achieved nothing. The betrayal was not just political, but emotional. The promises of honor, glory, and conquest had burned away, leaving only ashes. Yet in those ashes, something unexpected was taking shape, an identity forged not in victory, but in survival. When the guns fell silent, the United States looked around at the wreckage. Cities had been burned, thousands had died, and the treasury was drained. On paper, nothing had changed. The borders were the same. The treaties restored the status quo. But in the hearts of the people, everything was different. The war, though costly and uncertain, gave the nation something it desperately needed: confidence. America had stood against Britain once more and had not been defeated. The defense of Fort McHenry became a symbol of resilience. The stunning victory at the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson's ragtag army crushed a veteran British force, gave the people a final surge of pride. Though the battle came after peace had been signed, news traveled slowly, and Americans celebrated it as proof of triumph. The betrayal of native allies and the suffering of ordinary families remained dark scars on the legacy. But for the young Republic, the War of 1812 was a rite of passage. It confirmed that the United States was not just a fragile experiment, it was a nation, bloodied but unbroken. In the years that followed, Americans told the story of the war not as a stalemate, but as a victory of spirit. They remembered the flames of Washington, the rockets over Baltimore, and the banner that still waved at dawn. And in that memory, they found pride. The War of 1812 became known as the Second War of Independence, and though it left behind wounds and betrayals, it also gave birth to something powerful, a belief in America's destiny. The War of 1812 ended without new borders, without grand conquests, and with scars that cut deep. But sometimes survival itself is victory. Against the greatest empire in the world, America held its ground, and in the smoke of burning cities and the thunder of cannons, a new identity was born. The nation that once fought to exist now fought to endure, and endured it did. From the ashes of betrayal rose pride. From the roar of battle came a song, and from the struggle itself emerged the truth. America would never again be just a fragile experiment. It was a nation, unbroken, unyielding, and here to stay.